Now, the purpose of this session, the last session, is really to take up this idea about, in this very, very cruel and hard times that we're living in this sort of neoliberal era, how can we take some of the single issue campaigns that we're working around and how can we build a political culture? So the idea is that Suresh and Phil are going to help us by throwing out a few ideas very quickly at the beginning, and then we'll hear from you. And so I'm just going to ask each of them a question. Suresh, who you know because he spoke earlier, is the director of the monitoring group, which came out of the Southall monitoring group, which I think was the first police monitoring group in this country at a time when there were many, many police monitoring groups, in London in particular. So he's got a rich history to draw from, but we want to talk about today, Suresh, and I think see the start of the film off by saying that history is moving too fast for us to catch it on the wing, but we need to take stock. So that's what I wanted to ask you. Taking stock, what would you say are the activities around racism that are on the ground? What are the things that you would prioritise, particularly in terms of the fight against state racism?
I don't think it's possible to quarrel with Siva's analysis of seismic changes that are taking place on a political, economic, and global level. And I think the challenges for anti-racists over this period are the following, and you need to put it in this context. In the 70s and 80s, it was possible to have sizable autonomous struggles on race against racism, built on communities that were the most violated, whether it's to do with police practices, deaths in custody, racial violence, stop and searches, gang culture, and the stigmatization and marginalization of black minority communities. And although some of the activities were influenced by radical left politics, it seems to me that now, in order to create a popular anti-racist movement, given that there's an absence of that, of the left now, and you have different movements, spontaneous movements coming up, the Occupy, who I have worked with, the animal rights activist and the environmentalist, who don't have a common aim and a purpose and a goal. One of the things that we have to consider is how we create a new narrative about what goals we have and how we develop it. The problem with the anti-racist movement is that it was decimated, defeated after some time, and atomized. And actually, family justice campaigns came as a result of that defeat. I don't mean defeated in the way Paul Gilroy speaks about it. I'm talking about defeated in a very sharp community struggle. We've had New Cross massacre and a massive demonstration. The 81 riots that we participated in, taking place in 30 cities, resulted in about 5,000 people being sent to prison. The only campaign that won was the Bradford 12 campaign. The only campaign that won, which I was part of, was the acquittal of 12 defendants who made petrol bombs in Bradford, and they won on the basis of what self-defense is in legal terms, and they were acquitted. Every single other campaign, from St. Paul's to Brixton to whatever, led to imprisonment. That took away serious activists or community activists on the ground. So one of the things that we have to develop and take stock of is how that defeat pulverized our movement. And people like the Southall Monitoring Group, other spontaneous struggles, created a new dimension of the struggle, which was actually bringing into the public domain the tragedies suffered by individuals who represented a greater tragedy. And the Lawrence campaign is a pivotal example of that. But I don't think it's possible to repeat those kind of campaigns. And I don't actually believe, and I'm one of the movers of family justice campaigns, as families being central, I don't think it's possible at this moment, and this needs to be debated, and I've been involved in about 50 death cases and had family campaigns. I don't think it's possible to have just families leading and at the center of the campaign. I think it needs a tripartite system where you have families, community activists, and a legal course of action which exposes the state injustice, right? And I think that can work, etc. But what it does require, to answer your question in a roundabout way, is for the anti-racist movement to connect somehow to a larger body of people who are suffering and are being impacted due to the privatization of public services. So for the first time, anti-racist groupings have to connect with working class communities and actually create a new narrative on it. And if you don't do it, it's not possible for you to influence the general thing. That's the first thing. The second is, I think our communities have experienced massive changes. It's not that we are more affluent. In fact, communities I live in, like Southall, by and large have become poorer and poorer, and the austerity has made people even more poorer. And there are pockets of real poverty in our community, and we are left with situations where we just don't deal with racism and policing. Every single change or taking away of a welfare, attack on welfare state, taking away child benefit or whatever, actually becomes a very pivotal issue of survival for families. So we're at loss on how you create that momentum for change. And I've always said that we have to create a rainbow coalition of radical thought and action. The problem is that we come from a far left influenced tradition despite our autonomy, and we wear our sectarian clothing. And we haven't actually overcome that. So even people that I have worked with, and we worked in similar campaigns, have never taken that dive and said, let's create that momentum for change. And what's been inspirational in my relations with Siva has been that at every moment of a struggle that has taken place, we've always discussed that movement for change, whether it's on theoretical change or political or etc. But in practice, some of the developments that have taken place, which are community-based or national-based, hasn't led to a qualitative building of that movement. Is it possible for us to develop a momentum with environmental activists, etc.? Well, yeah, it's a big question. And I think Siva is right, and we've been saying this for a long time. We know what we are against. And if capitalism is transforming in such a rapid way, I'm not sure whether I agree that you cannot influence national states despite the shifting boundaries. I think it is still possible to change on local domestic policy. I think the state and multinationals have an immense absorbing power of co-opting people. And even, I think, people like Nigel Farage, who's a city broker, masquerading as an insurgent to the system, will be co-opted, and I don't see that as a threat. But it has a massive consequences for black and migrant communities. And how we resist that is a central question. And if you cannot convince it on a national basis, I think we're in real trouble. And its mindset of creating a national impact despite the global changes is the most serious question we face.
It's funny that Suresh should make this point about the need to form an alliance between the anti-racist movement and sort of the new movements coming around about privatisation, cuts, environment, because actually we've been doing the cuttings at the Institute of Race Relations, John and Ryan and Reed, back to the cuttings. And one thing that is definitely coming out from the cuttings is an explosion of activism around housing in particular, but also the way that new collective groups are forming, and small workers' cooperatives. And I went on the website to look at Corporatewatch's website, and Phil is going to speak to us about Corporatewatch, and it's billed as a small workers' cooperative looking at social and environmental impacts of corporate power. So the question that I wanted to ask Phil came a little bit out of Siva's interview, when Siva said that power resides with multinational companies, with the banks and finance capital. And I wanted to ask Phil, how are the networks Corporatewatch works with taking that on?
Okay, thanks Liz. It's an honour to speak at this event. Sivanandan, his writings have had a big influence on my thinking and the work that I do. So Corporatewatch is a very small cooperative. There's 6 people, 6 of us who work there. Okay. I can just hold it. Is that better? Yeah.
Give me that.
So there's just 6 people at Corporatewatch, and our motto is information for action. So we try and do research that's useful for all sorts of different campaign groups and different movements. And some of the campaigns that we've been supporting recently, like Liz mentioned, particularly with housing, there's a lot of new movements against housing that seem to be gaining quite a bit of ground, with the Aylesbury estate being one recent example. There's also new sort of environmental movements against all the fracking technology in the north of England and in the south as well, lots of different groups active against that. There's also research into British companies that are involved in Israel's occupation of Palestine, and information about that is used for different boycott campaigns. The work that I do is mostly about the companies that detain and deport asylum seekers, and often those companies are the same ones like G4S that are involved in privatising parts of the police and in running private prisons as well, so there's a lot of overlap there with the deaths in custody work that the Institute do. And then also been looking at Greece quite a lot, and the bailout programme in Greece and the austerity package there. And I guess that's one of the most stark examples of how banks and finance can control a country. And now with the new government in Greece trying to overthrow or renegotiate the bailout agreement and standing up to the Troika, and the risk of that is that they might lose their current, might have to pull out the euro and go back to the drachma. So there's all those things going on, and often you find that there's similar investors behind a lot of the companies across all these different sectors, same investors or same banks, and that's one way of sort of joining up the campaigns, is showing that it's the same banks or investors behind the different corporations. But I think this point about the currency being, what Siva was saying about finance capital being so powerful now, if you look at the Scottish referendum last year and how the No campaign so successfully used the issue of the currency, and getting or different leaks from the Treasury saying these banks are going to pull out of Edinburgh if the Yes campaign win, and the fear that was able to generate effectively, it could have been decisive in the outcome of the referendum there. But I think there's, although I agree that corporations do have a lot of power and the banks behind them, I don't think that they completely control states, and I think some states are a lot more powerful than other ones. So particularly with the British state, if you see now with the independence movement in Scotland and the threat that poses to the power of the British state, and then earlier this week there was a big blockade of the naval base in Fastlane, and that was front page of all the Scottish papers, but barely got a mention in the sort of so-called national media, the London media here. So I think that's a reminder that Britain is still a very powerful military, and when we're talking about all these deaths in the Mediterranean, people forget Britain has naval bases in Gibraltar, has Royal Air Force bases in Cyprus, very much has a presence in the Mediterranean. If we can afford to keep that, why can't Britain afford to rescue migrants who are drowning in that sea? And that military power, I don't really think it's waning. I mean, if anything, it's increasing with a new Royal Navy base being built in Bahrain, which I think is just staggering that Britain is able to have that done for it effectively by the Bahraini monarchy in this day and age. So I think whilst multinational companies do have a lot of power, it's backed up by military power, and certain states have more military power than others. And so I think there's different campaigns both against companies but also against states and different state projects and state repression. So yeah, those are just a few of the campaigns that I'm aware of or at the moment, but I'm sure people who have come here will be involved in lots of campaigns themselves, and yeah, we'll talk about that.
Okay, I'm going to open it up. Let's see if you have. I've got Jane over there. Some of you have not spoken. Colin, you've spoken. I will call you. Come on, don't be shy. I just wanted to say one thing to add to that, just a piece of information. What's interesting is in Wrexham, they're about to build there's plans to build the biggest prison in the whole of Europe. I think it's over 2,000 places, and it's actually the campaign against fracking, the environmental movement, who are actually opposing that prison expansion. So I think that's a good example of collective work. So we're going to take Jane and then you, and then we'll go at the very back.
My name's Jane Chalice. I've been a teacher and an activist all my life, and unfortunately, as I'm not young, so the first thing you ask me.
You are young, my darling.
In my head, but not physically. But I'm really glad that the two of you have spoken. I think when Suresh talks about the need for some sort of, you didn't use the word umbrella and you didn't use the word coalition or anything, but it's coming together in a way, I think, of people who are involved in a whole layer of different campaigns around race and anti-racist work, needing as well to respond to what in fact is happening politically in terms of austerity is really, really important at this moment. And I think when Phil mentions the two big political events that have occurred in the last year, first of all, the Yes campaign in Scotland. Yes, they didn't win, but it's created such a movement north of the border that has created, therefore, a real problem for the British state. It's an attack on the monarchy, although of course the SNP don't talk about it, certainly the City of London, and the most important thing is what we're watching is the attack on Westminster. And all of us, any of us who saw that debate last week, where Farage is standing next to a woman, and when he makes the most appalling statement about the NHS being basically receiving and having to pay for people who have got AIDS. It was who said immediately to him, that is completely unacceptable. The three Westminster politicians didn't even bat an eye. And it was the three women there who in fact were responding. And I think that was something that comes out of that whole movement north of the border. But the other thing is Greece, and I think Greece is really important because it is the example of a state within Europe that is being squeezed to death. And I think we've got to be aware that in the next month it's going to be an issue where we're going to see Europe possibly forcing Syriza to get rid of its left wing, to adopt some sort of alliance with the right, and to begin to even weaken what it's done at the moment, which is very little. But the one thing that Greece did, and that the Syriza government did within the space of a week, was it made a statement about migration, which was almost unbelievable when you think what the Greek nation-state has been. It said that they would permit any child born to a migrant or an asylum seeker in Greece to be Greek. Now, when you think of what they were like over Macedonia, it's absolutely unbelievable, but it's a really important move. And whether, in fact, they're ever going to be able to accomplish it and be able to sort of carry out those policies is very, very difficult. But I think it is something where, and I agree with Phil, I'm not sure that it's just as easy to say that it's the corporations who run the world. The states, all of them have power. And we look at the United States, the reason why people are throwing themselves into the sea in Libya is not because of what's just happened, it's what's happened 15 years ago when the Americans and the British decided to go in to, first of all, Afghanistan and then into the Middle East in such a way that it's created huge political problems right the way through. And I think all of us know that. But it is something that I think, you know, in terms of what we are witnessing at the moment, it's hugely important that we do ensure that we support all these sort of movements and try and find ways of voting them together.
Reen, we're going to take the guy in the very back row. Ross, I'm going to take you in the next round if you don't mind. I've got 3 and then you.
So yeah, basically people seem to be talking right now about building links between anti-racism campaigns and various other campaigns, housing campaigns, environmental, animal rights, anti-fascist housing as well, yeah, so on. So I mean, this is just a thought, and I was wondering what the speakers and everyone else thinks of this possibility. Obviously, you've got this Occupy Democracy coming up. I mean, it's not a huge movement right now, but I know they do have from May the 1st to May the 10th, 10 days of sort of organising around the elections. Now, I don't personally think we're going to have any influence on the elections. Okay, people have put housing on the agenda, that's good, but I still think there's no chance right now if we put anti-racism on the agenda in any positive way. And there are limitations to what I'm going to suggest because this is a centralised thing in central London, it's not a community-based approach. But essentially, I'm a bit worried that there could be a UKIP Tory coalition or some kind of right-wing, far-right government after the next elections, which would, especially as Labour don't even want to ally with SNP, and it's going to be disastrous. And I think it's possible that if we could get all our anti-racist groups and various activist groups together for Occupy Democracy, this could give us 10 days of discussion to help build a movement to maximise resistance if this right-wing coalition does come to power. So what are people's views on this?
Okay, we're going to take 3, then I'll let Suresh and Phil come back, and then we'll take another 3. So I think we have down here. I'm particularly encouraging if you come from outside London as well, because I know that's another thing that everyone gets upset about. Things are very London dominated. Not looking at Manchester.
I don't come from outside London.
That's
I have returned from Sri Lanka, which is 6,000 miles away. That counts.
That counts, okay.
Although it's not so good for the carbon footprint. Just to let people know, amongst Sri Lankan writers, 2 interesting books have come out in the last few years. One was written by my father's cousin and an uncle on Africa by George Alagaya, the BBC newscaster, which was a great book explaining about how he grew up in Africa and Ghana specifically. But the other book he had was on From Immigrant to English Boy, title which I don't particularly agree with. However, my mother's brother, person in the film, wrote When Memory Dies, and I would recommend all of you as internationalists to try and read that book, because it's important not just to see Sri Lankan people as somehow popping up and doing other things. We have issues in our own country which are still current. Many people in my country want to see this book translated into Sinhala and Tamil, which hopefully we will do. And one of the most interesting sayings of Sivanandan is that I came here because you came there. It's important to remember that imperialism means that many people have come here who wouldn't normally have come here, and that needs to be stressed again and again. As an internationalist, I have campaigned for the Yes campaign in Scotland, so it's important to fight the anti-colonial struggle where you are.
Yeah. And the film and When Memory Dies are on sale out there. I didn't plan that, but if you've got a bit of spare money and you want something that's still on sale. So you guys, do you want to come back to any of those points?
I wasn't just saying that we should build links between different disparate groups for the sake of building links. That's not the point I was trying to make, because that is actually necessary to do whether we have a strong anti-racist movement or a weak anti-racist movement. What I was trying to say is that the anti-racist struggle has taken many different forms. And it's about time we put race back into the anti-racist struggle in a big way and in a popular way, despite or in spite of the fact that there is a movement both in terms of national and global level, etc. And we have tried to create, for example, links between other social groups on hate crimes. The bombing, for example, of Brixton that took place just after the Lawrence case, as well as against the gay pub in central London. Now, you can build solidarity movements. I think the historical lesson tells us that either when something has really gone wrong, a death, a tragedy, or invasion, or we won a victory, and people come together and resonate around you. And that created a massive opportunity for us to bring disparate groups suffering, violence by fascists against black, gays, etc. And it only lasted about 3 months. Because what happens is the momentum develops, but actually most people don't really understand the nature of black communities and how they're affected. And I'm being very honest. I'll give you an example. There are movements now for Black Lives Matter on what's happening in the United States. And good luck to them. But I think those movements have been developed by far left, black people in the far left groups have come out of it. And they're likely to implode any minute. But nobody has created that movement of Black Lives Matter in this country, despite massive deaths that have taken place in custody on the streets. So it's very easy for us to have a very romanticized vision of being critical about other countries. But the hard knocks that we take here are very difficult to manage. So the struggles or the links that I'm talking about have to be very concrete. And I know from being involved, there's an opportunity for us, for example, to bring these people together on an inquiry that's taking place on how undercover policing, spied on the Lawrences, people like the monitoring groups, other groups here, environmentalists, animal rights activists, etc. That inquiry has been announced in common. But just getting people around the table just to discuss that has been very difficult, and it will be difficult to take us a year. Do we create a movement out of it? We should, but it's going to be a very difficult task. The second thing is that amongst us who've been working in black communities, there's a hesitation of coming together. And it's based on a number of factors. Firstly, our individual records of compromising with the state on periods, all right? I'm not saying I compromise, some other people who compromise on the state, right? The death of popular anti-racism, promoted by left of Labour, which is decimated, that doesn't exist. So the space that was created for a national discussion to take place doesn't exist. And really unchallenged growth by anti-racists of people like UKIP, and I say unchallenged because the ferocity of campaigns that we waged against the BNP and the National Front by those communities haven't been replicated against UKIP. And we have a popular racism, so-called acceptable racism against Muslims, against migrants, etc. And really uncharted, in my view, very weak campaigns against war on terror. I'm not talking about the movement against the war, which I was part of with Jane and other people. I'm saying from our communities, linking those struggles on war against terror, where we have seen dramatic erosion of rights of individuals who have been arrested, as well as the growth of Islamophobia. They are massive obstacles for us. So those kind of experiences should have galvanized the anti-racist movement to come together, etc. And it hasn't, for various reasons. So even if we jump towards creating the links, and the reason why I raised, I'm sorry, I don't want to take time. Unfortunately, when I'm given the time, I just keep on speaking. So I don't know when to shut up. But the reason why I'm saying this is because I think Siva's point about the nature of expanding the struggle to hold the state to account beyond the issue of race is a very critical one. So if we don't create those organic links with individuals who are discriminated against or oppressed on the issue of class, then the anti-racist struggle will become very marginalized, as it is already. That's the point. That's the reason why I was saying what I was saying.
Phil, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, I'll just try and come back to this point about. I can't talk that much about the Greek experience, but from what I've seen in Scotland is you have had different groups, different campaigns. Sorry. In Scotland, it seems like there's been different groups and campaigns coming together. So from anti-nuclear campaigns to migrant rights campaigns and all these other different groups coalescing under what is effectively a national independence movement. And the Scottish national identity has been used in an inclusive way to mobilise people very powerfully. And that's something that I think in the Scottish context can work. I think in England, it's going to be much harder to build links between these different campaigns. The English national identity obviously can't be used in the same way, and if anything, it's groups like Ravi was saying about with UKIP. I mean, that is their mobilising factor, is this sense of English votes for English people and English laws for English voters. The thing that David Cameron said the day after the referendum result. So I think there's a different political terrain in England to Scotland, and it's going to make it harder to form these alliances. I think in Scotland, in a way, they've been able to use the nationalism, which, although it's kind of taboo on the left, nationalism is a hugely powerful mobilising factor. And if it's an inclusive national identity, then I'm not too hesitant about it. But I don't know what can be done. I think it's going to be a lot harder in England to build these links, but hopefully there can be ways of doing it.
We're running out of time, and we want to give Siva the last word, and we've got a little audio. But I had two hands. I had Gus and I had Avery, and unless I know Colin had his hand up, and he might sack me because he's the chair, but he's going to take us out anyway. So we have. Is there another? What you're flapping, no, Colin? No. Oh right. Okay, Gus and then Avery.
Thanks. I want to make a comment about the question you put to us, Liz, really, about where now and where does one take all of this. And I want to comment specifically on education. As somebody who's been an educationalist all my life, it depresses me greatly that there is not in this country a national movement or anything like it against democratization of education in the last period. There have been a range of interventions of one sort or another, and I either go to things or I get invited to speak at stuff. And what amazes me is that whether it be in Committee Room 14 in the House of Commons or wherever else, you have people like Reclaim Education doing fantastic work, and other groups I could mention. And I turn up there and I find that I'm one of about 5 black people. Other educationalists, progressive people, white audiences completely. And yet, the people who are feeling the brunt of all of that marketization stuff and academies and so on, academies are excluding black students at a rate. Some 179 of them excluded more students than 13,000 maintained schools put together. And the impact of that, of course, is the link between school exclusion and youth offending, and the fact that many of those young people are joining the ranks of those who are considered surplus to requirements and are being treated like that by the police and other arms of the state, and particularly finding themselves in prison. So the whole neoliberal approach to education and the idea that individuals must look for themselves and make sure that your child is one of those getting the 10 A-star grades and the 5 A grades in GCSEs, and the devil take the hindmost, that sort of thing is going on very much within black communities themselves. And so even the institutions that we built, the black supplementary schools, I was involved with some of the people in starting the first one in Birmingham in 1968, for example. Even those are now being transformed into places where children could be assisted to gain those high-level grades, and yet their political education, their understanding of what's happening to the families, to themselves, to the group to which they belong in the society is zilch. So it seems to me that there is a massive question about how we engage progressive groups in the kind of way that Suresh is suggesting around the question of education, so that people see it as having an impact on working class students, on black students, and in a manner that links into this whole prevent agenda and the rest of it. Some of us in the so-called black community got involved in supporting the East Birmingham community around that Trojan horse issue. I attended meetings of the members of my organization, did likewise. But generally speaking, the black community had nothing to say about that. It kept totally askance from all the stuff going on around Trojan horse and the prevent agenda and what have you. So I believe that we were in a state where that whole business is concerned. And what I think it would be useful to do is to look at what is going on in terms of schooling and education. I'm working with some people at UCL here, where I am an associate professor, on issues around the white curriculum and why isn't my professor black and so on. And that's making some inroads. We're getting UCL to look at its heritage, Cyril Burt, Galton, the eugenicists, and all of that kind of stuff. But across the piece, schools, colleges, universities, I do not get a sense of what this country, whoever runs the state at any one time, what they see as the purpose of schooling and education in equipping young people today to build the society of the future. And I think that has serious implications for all of us.
Thank you, Gus.
Thank you.
Okay, Ava is bowing out, so I can take one more.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to what you were saying about commercialisation of education and this idea of disparate struggles being isolated from each other. I just spent 2 weeks in an occupation at Goldsmiths University, and that was originally a protest against commercialisation and counselling cuts and things like that. And what it became was like a recognition of our location within New Cross in a deprived neighbourhood. And so we took the movement beyond the student body and invited in local people. And in 2 weeks it became a space where we discussed sex workers' rights, cuts to counselling services, pay disparity, diversifying the curriculum. And I think with this like erosion of trade unions, we need to create our own like networks outside the institutions, which aren't just train drivers, aren't just teachers, aren't just students, aren't just anti-racist activists. It's all of them together tackling all these issues: classism, racism, sexism, and I think there's strength in creating those kind of hybrid forums.
Great. I think that says that. And we have an alternative race and alternative news service on anti-racist and social justice issues. Sorry, we changed the name a couple of weeks ago and I forgot. I'm sacked. And those are exactly the sorts of struggles that we want to see represented on our news service. Is there anyone else? Oh, Sujata.
Yeah, just wanted to say that those kind of struggles are going on. I mean, I think Suresh made a really important point about making those connections, and I think those connections are happening on a very, very small level in communities. So just for example, I think when we talk about campaigns against cuts and austerity and you know, local authority funding, it's worth pointing out that those cuts often fall on the poor black communities the most. When we talk about housing struggles, talking about like what's very much a racialised aspect to gentrification and people being forced out of London in particular, but also other cities. So just to kind of end on a positive, slightly positive note, is just to say that they are happening. They're very small, and I think our challenge is how do we link them all together? How do we make those bigger and create some sort of, whether you want to call it a rainbow coalition or an umbrella group? But I mean, I think that's where we need to be going back to our communities and talking about building on that for the future.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Okay, unless you guys have anything burning to say.
No. Don't start me on it.
I think that was, thank you so much for sharing all your ideas with us, and thank you for coming and celebrating Institute and Siva with us. I think Colin's going to come and say a few last words, and then we're going to play the audio of Siva, which is, I think, a nice way to end. Thank you.
Colin's trying to say
Colin says we're just going to go straight into telepathy. He told me we're going straight into the audio.
Conversation with Colin was recorded in 2011. I've been asked to update some of those ideas for this event on 18th April. It is now clear that neoliberalism is not working. All that stuff about wealth trickling down, no society, only individuals, the market as a regulator of everything, has been shown to be false in terms of everyday reality. What Tory ideology has produced on the ground are closures to libraries, youth centres, hospitals, the selling off of housing estates, benefit caps, workfare programs. The combination of austerity and marketization has impacted on the sheer need to exist. Hence the protests, the coalition against poverty, unemployment workers groups, boycott workfare networks, the students' campaign against fees and cuts, stop G4S, campaigns against PFI, and indeed the right to protest itself. There is a beginning of dissent in the air, the stirrings of rebellion. And those that I mentioned are the more immediate, ad hoc, on-the-ground campaigns born of need. When you have been reduced to the bone of existence, there is no alternative but to rebel. The ways and means will spring up in the course of action. Occupations, sit-ins, sleep-ins, pickets, boycotts. At another level are the growing numbers of self-help groups and community-based initiatives which fill the vacant spaces that the state has left in the social fabric. A sort of alternative infrastructure based on necessity, such as community-run libraries, shops and cafes, cooperative workshops, alternative education and advice centers. And then, of course, there are the emerging networks which are beginning to connect the developments in particular spheres, such as disabled against cuts, radical housing networks, fuel poverty action, Corporatewatch, people before profit, the tax justice. Actions themselves can be at a number of levels. On individual cases, say against a deportation or a sacked whistleblower, or on issues like saving Lewisham Hospital from closure, preventing Barnet Council outsourcing services lock, stock and barrel till there is no local government left, or challenging guilt by association in the joint enterprise law. Then there are causes being joined, like that of police spying and corruption, the reining in of a runaway media, the dirty duty to snoop imposed on teachers, doctors, youth workers in the hunt for potential jihadis. And on the international level, there are the hosts of campaigns and petitions against TTIP, which challenges national sovereignty. All these may not have as yet come consciously together to become a movement, but that will come when the variety of struggles begin to find a common denominator in their common opposition to a state, which, as I've said before, is no longer the nation state, but the agent of global capital and its agent, the market. And it is the market which sets the political culture that sets people against themselves. The market speaks to profit, not to values, to social control, not to social cohesion, to personal greed, not to individual responsibility. Its lifeblood is privatization, not public ownership. Its heart beats to the tune of giant corporations. It pauperizes the third world and feeds them scraps from the imperial table. It pauperizes the third world, It pauperizes a third of its own people and feeds them scraps of social reform. It weighs up personal relationships in a balance sheet of profit and loss till we no longer listen to each other or hear the pain of the world. The market corrupts, and the free market corrupts freely. And it is with that awareness of how destructive market forces are of the human condition that we will create a political culture that does not accept the ruling ideas of the ruling class. One caveat though, the state, whether Tory or Labour led, has armed itself with all the new powers of surveillance helped on by technology, a substitute for legislation and the politics of fear. But the spaces are there for us to fight back in, and the time is here to be seized.